Today, the latest weapons, coupled with the fighting skill of the American soldier, stand ready, on the alert all over the world to defend this country, you, the American people, against aggression. This is The Big Picture, an official television report to the nation from the United States Army. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
We often think of an Army division merely as being a vast, impersonal organization of men and equipment. Yet to the men who form its ranks, each division possesses a distinct character all its own. To them, the division is a source of pride, a singular team to which they belong. It is their division. And so it is with the men of the 25th Infantry Division who took part in the story you are about to see. The story of their Tropic Lightning Division in Korea.
Ask any 25th Division man. He'll tell you the story really began the day they occupied Japan back in 1945. Maybe he'll even brag a little about that occupation, and with good reason. For upon arrival, he found only the fear and suspicion of a former enemy. Yet during the 5 years that followed, he succeeded in winning their admiration and respect as a trusted friend. Yes, the story began here, for on June 25th, 1950, the division was still in Japan when the neighboring South Koreans were invaded. North Korean communists had crossed the 38th parallel in force. Machine guns would be no match against the Russian-built tanks spearheading the attack from the north. The Republic of South Korea called for immediate assistance. The United Nations heard and answered. Within 2 weeks after the North Korean invasion, Japanese port cities were humming as the 25th Division rushed to support the beleaguered South Koreans. On July 7th, advance elements of the 25th took their last look at Japan as they set sail for Busan, following close on the wake of their sister division, the 24th. Thus, the men of the 25th became the second United States division to arrive in Korea. The first Tropic Lightning unit to unload was the famed 27th Regimental Combat Team, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Michaelis, later promoted to Brigadier General. There was going to be some hard fighting ahead, and these men knew it. Green, fresh from occupation duty, a few managed a nervous smile, but only a few. Even while later units were still debarking, these earlier arrivals were already on their way to the front. The situation at that time was critical. Replacements were badly needed to bolster UN positions all along the hard-hit line. As a result, the newly arrived men of the 25th found themselves heading for different sectors of the front. Committed piecemeal in this way, these Tropic Lightning troops were yet to function under their own banner. Then, on July 20th, the 25th assembled as a division and took up defensive positions in the north near Sangju. This placed them on a perimeter, face to face with the advancing enemy. Now, fighting together as a single team, the men of the 25th watched and waited for their first real test under fire. They were bidding for precious time while other UN reinforcements could be rushed to Korea. They watched and they waited, and then... For a week, wave after wave of fanatic Reds hit the thinly held line, only to be repulsed. By the end of July, these overnight veterans of the 25th had stopped more than 30,000 enemy troops in their sector. Meanwhile, a new menace had developed. An enemy force had driven south along the west coast and was now threatening to engulf Busan. Once again, the 25th Division was called upon to stem the onslaught. On August 1st, Tropic Lightning troops prepared for what was later described as a history-making maneuver. Under cover of darkness, the entire division was shifted 150 miles south to meet the Busan-bent Reds head-on in the Chinju-Masan corridor. Once in the new sector, tank infantry teams launched an aggressive defense designed to keep the massing enemy off balance. They were still fighting for time, with the sea at their backs. Then the order came down: stand or die. That month and a half saw one of the greatest stands in the history of warfare, the Busan perimeter. Once again, we had stopped the enemy. For the men of the 25th, however, it was a costly victory. But time was running out for the North Koreans. Their gamble for a quick conquest had failed, for they had not reckoned the United Nations into their timetable. Then on September 15th, 1950, the enemy's clock stopped. The place? Incheon, high up on the west coast of Korea. With the U.S. 10th Corps spearheading the amphibious assault, the Reds suddenly found themselves caught in a squeeze play. The Incheon landing was the signal for the long-awaited breakout from the Busan perimeter. Quickly overcoming initial enemy resistance, the men of the 25th were soon on the move across the Korean peninsula, bypassing many trapped North Koreans in the south. Despite numerous mines and blown bridges that slowed the advance, the Tropic Lightning Division reached the west coast of Korea by the end of September, a distance of almost 200 miles. Immediately, they began Operation Mop-Up. House cleaning, 25th Division style. Results? Excellent. Tropic Lightning troops rounded up more than 14,000 prisoners during October, while 8th Army continued to pursue the enemy north. In addition to handling POWs, the men of the 25th had other responsibilities. South Korean civilians by the thousands were flocking back to their liberated homes. Helping them was a pleasure. November found the division again heading north. Chinese troops had been reported crossing the Yalu River. On November 27th, the Chinese struck in force. For the men of the 25th Division, the remainder of 1950 turned into a deadly game of leapfrog as they fought and withdrew. And then fought and withdrew again before the advancing horde of Chinese. It was another war, but they'd be back. The new year found the division on the outskirts of Seoul. While other UN troops retired from the battered city, elements of the 25th were picked to fight the delaying action which covered their withdrawal. All that stood between these UN troops and the advancing Reds was the rear guard of the 25th Division, dug in north of town. Refugees, too, were fleeing Seoul, many for the second time. They preferred to take their chances on the road rather than stay and be dominated by the communists. Not until the last refugee and soldier had crossed the frozen Han River did these rear guard troops themselves pull out. It was close. The enemy flag had been flying over the fallen capital a full hour by the time the last bridge was blown. The long, weary withdrawal then continued south, finally coming to an end below Suwon. As 8th Army consolidated its forces, the men of the 25th waited for the order to begin the drive back north. It was bitter cold, but morale was high. The Chinese had had their day. We'd soon see if they could take it. Then the order came down, and on January 15th, 1951, the division began pushing northward. First objective, Suwon. As they neared the town, the men of the 25th encountered resistance from well-entrenched enemy troops. The infantry called for armored support to help them clear the way. Then the infantrymen took over as they moved in on Suwon itself, anxious to close with the enemy. Experts in the art of infighting, they also knew when to duck. Once inside the town, they had to check every hut for Reds, then double check. Within 5 days after the push had begun, the town of Suwon was in tropic lightning hands. The 25th was now ready to team up with the rest of 8th Army in a general offensive to drive the Reds back to the Han River. All along the line, UN forces moved out to meet the enemy. The 25th Division's mission in this coordinated offensive was the vital Yeongdong-po-Incheon Highway across the Han from Seoul. Enemy casualties first, real estate second. That was the stated purpose of this new drive. It was the kind of order a man could get his teeth into, and the tropic lightning men did just that. Every possible hiding place was checked for Reds. Civilians? Maybe they were, maybe not. Enemy resistance increased steadily as the division neared the Han. Rice paddies didn't offer a man much protection against the heavy fire being laid down by the Reds. Cover was precious, any kind of cover. When you're caught out in the open, there's only one solution: firepower. Keep the enemy's head down and then move up. By early February, enemy resistance had been reduced and the division continued on toward the Han River. They were getting close, and they knew it, as they started converging on their objective, Yeongdong-po. The town looked quiet enough, but it still paid to be careful. That red flag gave warning that enemy troops might still be hanging around, but once in a while a man enjoys throwing caution to the wind. The enemy had suffered 70,000 casualties during this latest 8th Army offensive, which now found the men of the 25th deploying along the banks and bridges of the Han itself. Across the river stood Seoul, still occupied by the Reds, but not for long. Even while they were trading shots with the enemy, the tropic lightning men were being slated for a major role in the next phase of 8th Army's offensive, Operation Ripper, the crossing of the Han. Shifted to positions 15 miles east of Seoul, the 25th prepared to spearhead the crossing on March 7th. It opened with the biggest barrage since the start of the war. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. Now the infantry took over. The first wave pushed off across the Han, already swollen by the fast-thawing snow. Others followed close behind, and within hours the bridgehead was secured. Once across, the division's rapid progress threatened to cut the enemy's supply line running into Seoul. Faced with imminent destruction, the Reds were forced to flee the capital city, which was to remain in UN hands once and for all. The men of the 25th continued pressing northward, opening the way for the entire 8th Army's advance. Then, the 38th parallel itself. Division morale was never higher, for spring and the men of the 25th had finally returned to North Korea. But the season also brought with it a threatening note. Chinese hordes were again massing in the north. The threat grew stronger and stronger as the division approached the Chorwan Valley, apex of the Iron Triangle. Then the Chinese spring offensive struck, the strongest of the entire war. This time, however, the 8th Army was prepared for it. The men waited while artillery methodically blasted the oncoming Reds. Then the 25th Division executed a series of systematic withdrawals. Planned well in advance, the movement was made with bare minimum losses of men and materiel. Delaying units kept the enemy in gun sight as the columns worked south. On April 30th, north of Seoul, the division moved into Line Golden, a prearranged defense line. Here, the men vowed to stop the massive communist offensive or die in the attempt. Here, they would make their stand with no quarter given or taken. This was the showdown, the final test of strength. The Chinese had promised to give Seoul to the North Koreans as a May Day gift, and now they were coming for it. What they got instead was a massacre. All along the line, the 8th Army held fast as 5 Chinese armies battered against a solid wall of fire. The enemy never fully recovered from this crushing defeat. It was to be his last major offensive of the Korean War. July 1951 found the men of the 25th Division taking a well-earned rest in reserve. For some, it was a month of sadness as they paid tribute to buddies who had fallen in combat. It was a time to remember the year that had passed. Sangju, the Busan perimeter, the capture of Suwon, the Han River crossing, the stand at Line Golden. For some, July was also a month of rejoicing. Rotation had come to Korea, and after a year of combat, these men were heading home. They too had much to remember, for these were veterans of the earliest days of the fighting. But that was all behind them now. For the world, July was a month of hope. The United Nations had demonstrated that it was determined to defend South Korea and would never be driven out. Realizing this, the communists finally agreed to talk peace. Yes, the world took hope that peace might soon again come to Korea. No one knew then that the communists intended to drag out the talks for 2 years. With the armistice negotiations underway, the Tropic Lightning Division once again took up defenses along the Iron Triangle. There were plenty of Chinese and North Koreans holed up in those hills, with plenty of fight still left in them. The men of the 25th wasted no time in letting the enemy know they had arrived. The Air Force chipped in to help plaster the Reds. During this period of fighting, the division's searchlight company was quite active. These powerful searchlights were used effectively in discouraging enemy night attacks. They were also handy in spotting targets for the artillery during night firing missions. The Reds soon learned to hate these glaring eyes. In the daytime, light aircraft took over the search for enemy targets. These planes were flown by men who were trained artillery observers as well as expert pilots. Vital members of the 25th Division team, these Army aviators played an outstanding role during the Korean War. The planes had no armor, but plenty of maneuverability. Almost daily, the pilots flew directly over enemy installations, normally hidden by massive mountains, and by radio directed immediate artillery fire on the Reds. Psychological warfare was also used extensively in the division sector during this period. Various means were used by these psychological warfare teams to induce the enemy to surrender. From the ground or from the air, they